Hello and welcome to the lab portion of the brain. So this is what a human brain looks like. This is called the whole brain model. Now we're looking at the inferior surface of it, but this is the whole brain. This is also a brain model, but this one has most of the brain removed, and so it's only the brain stem. Before we start talking about the brain specifically, we need to be able to orient ourselves. And one of the easiest ways to do this is to look for a rooster's face. So if you look in here, you should be able to see a rooster's face. You can see his eye. That's right at number 6 here. You can see its beak. You can see its comb. You can see its neck, its crop, its shoulder. There's a rooster's face in there. If you look at this model, the brain stem, you still see the rooster's face in there. Again, you can see the eye, the beak, and so on. Now, parts have been removed, so we can't see all of it, but still we can see the rooster's face. Well, this rooster's face is going to help us because the rooster always looks toward the front. And so the rooster, if it looks toward the front, that's the anterior. The other side is posterior, superior, inferior. Same thing here. It always looks toward the front, so we can tell anterior, posterior, and so on. You can even do it on the whole brain. So if you look in the real brain, it may not be quite as obvious, but you can still see the rooster's face in there. Remember, we divided the brain up into these different regions, and that's exactly how your checklist is divided up as well. So if you have your checklist out, look at it. You'll see Telencephalon, and then you'll see a bunch of structures. You'll see Diencephalon, same way all the way down. Well, let's look at this whole brain and figure out where these regions are. So the Telencephalon is the most superior part of the brain. It's all of this. And if you look at it, remember you have these gyri and sulci, these folds. So that's the telencephalon. The diencephalon is the rooster's face itself. And so it's this part here. It's sort of the core of the brain, and you cannot see the diencephalon from the surface. The mesencephalon is sort of the neck of the rooster, and you can see that here. It's also very hard to see the mesencephalon from the surface, but you can see a little bit of it anteriorly. And then we have the mesencephalon, and the mesencephalon is his crop and his shoulder. These are easily seen from the surface. And then finally, the little part hanging down at the bottom is the myelencephalon. If we look at it from the outside, again, you can see the telencephalon easily. You can see the mesencephalon and myelencephalon easily. You cannot see the diencephalon, and it's not really easy to see the mesencephalon. But here are those brain regions again. You can also see these brain regions on the brainstem model. Now you can only see a tiny bit of the telencephalon. It's the most lateral part in this picture, and you can see the little folds. Now there are also blood vessels there, which we didn't see on the other model. You can see the diencephalon. Remember, it's sort of the core of the brain. And right in the center where this model is split, right there is where the rooster's face is going to be. The mesencephalon you can see anteriorly, and this is, remember, the rooster's neck. And then the mesencephalon, part of it has been removed, the cerebellum, but this is the front part, the anterior part. And so this is the rooster's crop. And then the myelencephalon is the part that hangs down. One more time. Telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, and myelencephalon. Well, we're going to talk about the telencephalon first. And the telencephalon is by far the largest part of the brain. It's called the cerebrum, this large structure. And the word cerebrum literally means brain. Well, if you look at it, it's sort of sphere-shaped. And then it's divided into half, or 2 hemispheres. So we have a right hemisphere and we have a left hemisphere. And what separates the hemispheres is the longitudinal fissure. A fissure is a deep groove, and so you can see this deep groove right here. Same thing here on our brain model. If you look at the surface of the telencephalon, it's smooth, but it's not flat. It's folded up, similarly to an accordion. And so when you fold up things, you get ridges and you get grooves. And so the ridges are the smooth, rounded parts at the top that stick out. They look a little bit like worms or snakes. Those are the gyri. And then in between the ridges, these little shallow grooves, those are the sulci. So if we look here, you can see gyri and sulci. You'll also notice that blood vessels are located within the sulci. You can see these gyri and sulci on the median section as well. Remember, this upper part is also telencephalon. We already talked about a longitudinal fissure, but there's also another fissure. This fissure separates the cerebrum from another brain part, the cerebellum, and that's called the transverse fissure. So here's our longitudinal fissure and transverse fissure. Well, if you look at the cerebrum, it's divided up into three parts: the cerebral cortex, the cerebral white matter, and the cerebral nuclei. We're going to look at the cortex first. So if you remember from lecture, cortex, that word means rind, like a lemon rind or an orange rind or a watermelon rind. It's a surface, and it's not very thick. If you take a section or a plug out of it, you can see this cerebral cortex. It's gray matter. So the entire surface of the cerebrum is covered in gray matter. Now, if you go a little deeper, you're going to see white matter. The gray matter folds in with the sulci. It also folds in with the fissures. If you look at this, this is a coronal section through the brain. And again, you can see these folds. Again, they're gyri, the grooves, those are sulci, and you can see the cerebral cortex. And so the surface of it is gray matter. We can also easily see white matter deeper in. And then if you look where numbers 2 and 3 and so on are, you'll see gray matter in there as well. But that's not part of the cortex. Well, to talk about the cortex, it's easier if we divide it up into sections. And so it's divided up into lobes. We need boundaries for the lobes, and so we're going to use sulci. There are some sulci that are pretty much the same on all people. One of those is a parieto-occipital sulcus, but you can't see that one from the surface. You have to open up the brain in order to be able to see it. The others you can see from the surface, and the ones we're going to look at are the central sulcus and the lateral sulcus. So, if we use those sulci as boundaries, we can divide this up into lobes. So we have a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and an occipital lobe. And again, we're going to use those sulci as boundaries. There's also a fifth lobe of the cortex, but it's not visible from the surface because it's actually located inside the lateral sulcus. You would have to spread apart the lateral sulcus in order to see it. And so it's sort of insulated, and so we call it the insula. Now, our brain models don't come apart, but this one does. And so if you took this brain model apart, you would be able to see the insula there. We don't have this brain model, but what we do have is this brain model. So our midbrain model, if you look at it, has a little bit of gray matter on the surface. That is this insula. And so you can see how it would fit up in there and how it's inside the lateral sulcus. Well, the cortex is divided up into these different areas, which we talked about in lecture, called Brodmann's areas or functional areas. And so different areas of the cortex do different things. Well, they're really difficult to see on a real brain. And so we're not going to spend much time talking about very many of them. We are going to look at a couple. But if you look here, you can see what they do. You can see there's speech centers, writing, auditory, all the way around. You'll also notice that in the middle between the two hemispheres, is what's called the corpus callosum, and that's a bridge. And we'll talk about it a little bit later. So if we look at here, this is the medial section, and you can see that corpus callosum right there. It's got the letter A and P and Q on it. That is cerebral white matter. And so, again, it acts like a bridge that allows the two halves of the brain to talk to each other. And there are thousands and thousands of neurons that run through here. If you move just a little bit inferior to the corpus callosum, you'll find this, which is another band of white matter. And this is called the fornix. In between those two, indented a little bit and streaky on the model, is actually a membrane that separates the lateral ventricles. It's called the septum pellucidum. We can see those here. So there's our corpus callosum, our fornix, and our septum pellucidum. There are also two cranial nerves which attach to the cerebrum. One of these nerves is called the olfactory cranial nerve, and the other one is the optic cranial nerve. Well, not only do we have nerves, we also have some tracts. So if you look at the olfactory nerve, even though I have it labeled here, this isn't truly the nerve. The nerve runs from the nasal cavity up and joins onto the brain right here at the number 28. That's actually called the olfactory bulb. And then the information travels backwards along the olfactory tract. If we look at the optic nerve is carrying your sense of sight from your eyes, and the optic nerves join together right behind this pituitary gland. Now, if we remove the pituitary gland, you can see where they're joined together. They form sort of a cross, and the word for cross is chiasma. And so we have an optic chiasma. And then they split apart again into the optic tracts. Again, that is obscured by the pituitary gland. So if you look here in this picture, you can see the olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, the optic nerve, optic chiasma, and even though they don't have it labeled, the optic tracts. Let's look at the diencephalon. So remember, this is the rooster's face. And then hanging down off of that is the pituitary gland. We can see that here. Well, if you remember, the diencephalon is really more than the rooster's face. It's these two bulging masses which protrude into the cerebrum. Here's a lateral view, and if we look at it on the brainstem model, we can see these two bulging masses. Now remember, it's not the wrinkly part on the surface. That's the insula. It's deep to that, these two bulging masses. If we look at it on the whole brain, we don't get to see those two masses. We only get to see the part in the very center, and that's the thing that looks like the rooster's face. Well, the diencephalon is divided up into three parts. The rooster's face itself is called the thalamus. The rooster's beak is called the hypothalamus. And the rooster's back of his head is the epithalamus. Let's look at the epithalamus first. Well, depending on which brain half or which brain model half you're looking at, you're going to either have one structure or two structures. They both have something that's pink and looks a little bit like a tadpole. But this half doesn't have this red-blue structure that this half has. Well, the red-blue structure is a choroid plexus, and a choroid plexus is a tuft of blood vessels that secretes cerebrospinal fluid. The pink tadpole-looking thing is the pineal gland or pineal body. Remember, that's an endocrine gland that secretes the hormone melatonin. Again, the face of the rooster is the thalamus, and right in the center of that is something that looks like the rooster's eye. That's called the intermediate mass of the thalamus. Again, that tadpole-looking thing is the pineal gland. You can also see the choroid plexus and the pineal gland on the brain stem model. So we're looking at a posterior view of those, and we'll see the choroid plexus again is a tuft of blood vessels that makes cerebrospinal fluid. It is not the only one. There's one of these, at least one, in every ventricle. And then you can see the pineal gland. Again, that's what secretes cerebrospinal fluid. And the pineal gland secretes melatonin. Let's look at the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is the beak of the rooster. And then hanging down off of the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. And they're connected by something called the infundibulum. The pituitary gland, remember, is a gland that controls a lot of other glands. So that's the diencephalon. Let's look at the mesencephalon. So this is the rooster's neck. And so remember what we talked about in lecture, it's mostly tracts. And we can see two of these tracts right here. These tracts are called the cerebral peduncles. The word peduncle means legs or feet. So they're sort of like the feet or legs of the cerebrum. But what they are the pyramidal tracts. Those large tracts that come down from the primary motor area and go to all the individual skeletal muscles. Remember, these control precise, skilled movements. Here's a lateral view, and you can see those cerebral peduncles, and you can see it here on the model. If you look at the posterior side of the mesencephalon, you see four bumps. These are called the corpora quadrigemina. There are four of these, two top, two bottom. The top two are called superior colliculi, and remember they control visual reflexes. The bottom two are the inferior colliculi, and they control auditory reflexes. If you look at the whole brain in the sagittal section, you can also see the corpora quadrigemina here, but it's not quite as obvious. Also in this picture, you can see the cerebral or mesencephalic aqueduct. Remember, that connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. Let's look at the mesencephalon. So the mesencephalon has two parts to it, the pons and the cerebellum. Well, the pons doesn't have much going for it in the model. Now, we will see some cranial nerves that attach here, but for now, that's just what we're going to call it, is the pons. But the cerebellum, remember, is the second largest part of the brain. Here's our pons, and you can see those cranial nerves attached to it. But here's the cerebellum. Remember, it's very similar to the cerebrum. It has two hemispheres. So there's a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. Each hemisphere has lobes to it. Remember, it's separated from the cerebrum by the transverse fissure, and the two hemispheres of the cerebellum are connected by the vermis. If we look at it in section, you can see that inside we have this white tree-like formation. It's white matter. It's called the arbor vitae. And if you look at it, it looks like the tree has leaves. The leaves are gray matter, and they're called folia. They're ridge-like structures. And what they are there for is to increase the surface area. We can also see the fourth ventricle here. Remember the cerebellum, not only does it have hemispheres, it has lobes. Each side has 3 lobes. There's an anterior lobe, a posterior lobe, and one in the middle called the flocculonodular lobe. The cerebellum is also connected to other brain parts. It's connected by something called cerebellar peduncles. And if you look on this model, it looks a little bit like a music note. There are 3 pairs of these cerebellar peduncles. There are these, which are the superior. The biggest ones are the middle. And then we have the inferior ones a little bit below. You can also see in this picture, remember, our corpora quadrigemina. You can also see the pineal gland. You can also see the rest of the mesencephalon. Let's look at the myelencephalon. So the myelencephalon, remember, is the medulla oblongata. And mostly what this is tracts. Now it does do some processing, but it's mostly tracts, and the tracts are visible. You can see the tracts on the anterior surface here. They're longitudinal tracts, and they are called pyramids. These carry the pyramidal tracts. If you look from the side, you can still see the pyramids, not quite as well, but now you can see the olives, and the olives are where the second order neurons begin. And so there's cell bodies here. So this is gray matter.